welcome to our final session of our wonderful virtual program. Those of you who've been with us since day one, thank you very much. And those of you who are joining us for the first time, you're in for an absolute treat for our final session, which is called the Event of Photography. So we're going to have three speakers: Ariella Aïsha Azoulay, Gabrielle Moser, and Pinney. So let me introduce Ariella Aïsha, who really needs no introduction, but I will just say a little bit about her. It's really an amazing honor and pleasure to really welcome Ariella to our program. She is Professor of Modern Culture and Media and Comparative Literature. She's also a film essayist and curator of archives and exhibitions. Some of her really groundbreaking and important books have been most recently Potential History and Learning Imperialism, which came out in 2019, Civil Imagination, The Political Ontology of Photography, The Civil Contract of Photography, which was foundational to the Photodemos Collective, and her book From Palestine to Israel, a photographic record of destruction and state formation, as well as films such as Undocumented and Learning Imperial Plunder, Civil Alliances, Palestine 47 to 48, and exhibitions including Errata, which was for the Tapies Foundation in Berlin, Enough, The Natural Violence of New World Order in Leipzig. So without further ado, I hand you over to Aïsha. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nalu, for introducing me, and thank you, Chris, and the others for inviting me to be part of this conference. It's really a pleasure, and I would start by sharing my screen and presenting the case that seems to me one of the most important cases right now that are being debated in court, but is also, you know, as different ramifications and implications in relation to what we are all doing, right, and being engaged with photography. So it seems to me like a case that requires the support of everyone in this field, because what is at stake is a case for reparations. What is at stake is also the way that photography was institutionalized, mainly as an imperial project. And this kind of project of the photodemos, for example, is an attempt to unlearn these terms, right, in order to generate other options that were there. And I think that through this case that I will present right now, we can see, just a second, we can see how many questions come together. Some of them were already debated in this morning panel. So I would like to start by a quote from, you know, Tamara Lanier, who leads this, you know, lawsuit. Is my ancestors, she says, is not a museum asset. Just a second, I cannot switch. Okay, so here, rather than, you know, showing the images that still circulate by Harvard and the Peabody Museum of the daguerreotypes that were taken, that were seized from 7 enslaved people in South Carolina, rather than showing them like Harvard took the liberty to show them for many, many years and continue to claim its right to show them, I use a poster that was prepared by Lanier's daughter, in which Lanier's campaign is there, free Renty, bound by Harvard, already 170 years, enslaved. And the count of 170 years is since the year of the abolition of slavery, which means every year when Renty and the others are still held by Harvard, they are enslaved. In the daguerreotype held as private property by Harvard. And until Tamara Lanier stepped forward and claimed that these were her ancestors, these daguerreotypes have been assumed to be the private property of Harvard University. And this notion of private property as the only way to approach these photographs is completely wrong, is what I would call Victor's justice. So here what we see in this photograph is Tamara Lanier holding the daguerreotype, a print that she produced, close to her heart. So Lanier lawsuit was dismissed by Massachusetts court, and the appeal is pending, probably in November, and you are all invited to join this campaign and support it. You can reach out to me via email later or directly to Tamara Lanier. So what is Victor's justice? How can we see it in play in relation to this case? So the court, when they dismissed the case, they confirmed not only Harvard's possession of the daguerreotypes, but also the terms and the stake of the case. The court decides that the main question is that of possession, which means to whom does Renty Taylor's daguerreotype belong? And I think that we have, if we accept that this is not a property by ancestors who need caretaking, we have to counter this logic and we have to come up with a different question. We have to treat the image of Renty as a person who was used against his will rather than as an object. And the question that we have to ask is where and among whom will Renty find peace and recognition of his rights? So here you have, a screenshot of some of those daguerreotypes held by Harvard. And in holding these images as part of its archival and museal capital, Harvard also invites millions to continue to view Renty, Deliah, and the others, not as ancestors or relatives, but as enslaved people. And Harvard just published a huge book with great scholars around these daguerreotypes without consulting Tamara Lanier, without talking with Tamara Lanier, and they are working on the preparation of a biggest exhibition of those daguerreotypes. And I think that with this case, as scholars of photography, as practitioners of photography, we have the opportunity to redress what Renty and his relatives were deprived of in the 1850s. Because these daguerreotypes were taken in the 1850s, relatively close to the moment when the device, the daguerreotype, was invented, this will impact the way that photography and the rights that involved with photography will be redefined. So I would like to go, in the time that I have, to go through 4 points: the status of photographs, the question of the precedent, the question of crimes against humanity, which is a category that I think is necessary in order to address the afterlife of slavery, and repatriation, and the question of human remains. So let me start with the status of photographs. Harvard lawyers argue the rule is that a photograph is the property of the photographer, not the subject. And there are cases that we have cited in our brief, Harvard is saying, that apply that rule even in cases when the subject of the images did not consent to the images being captured. And this is a completely false argument, because we know that in the 1850s, the photographer did not have exclusive property rights in the images they produced. Just to mention, that visitors to the photographer's studios purchased the daguerreotype produced by their presence in front of the camera, which were their daguerreotypes, and they held them as property. And also we can, relate to a case that, took place in court relatively close to the taking of these daguerreotypes. In 1860, Louis-Auguste Bisson, the official photographer of Napoleon III, was commissioned by the painter Adolphe Yvon to take the emperor's photograph for Yvon to use as a model for one of his paintings. And when the painter realized that Bisson has printed many copies of the commissioned photograph, he feared that it would devalue his painting, and he sued the photographer, and he won. The court ruled that the photograph was the painter's property, not the photographer's property. And here in the image that I show you, again, I am refraining from circulating those images without any intervention, like Tamara Lanier and her daughter in the poster, or here when I removed the presence of the naked body of one of the enslaved, in order for us to look at this place where they were forced to enter in order to have their likeness being seized. When photographs were produced through force and in the service of a regime of violence, participants in the photographic encounter or in the photographic event, or their heirs and communities who were initially denied the right to control their own image should be heard and taken into account. The daguerreotypes of Renty and Deliah cannot be discussed with legal terms usually reserved to photographs, as they could only have been produced as part of a regime that perpetrated crimes against humanity. So before addressing the question of crimes against humanity, I would like to dwell on the question of the precedent. Because, you know, one of the deliberations of the explicit and implicit deliberations around this case is what will happen with all the other objects held in museums. So a decision to allow Renty to go home might raise questions about how this might pertain to other objects held in Harvard's museums and archives and in similar institutions in the West. But this case, if Renty will be allowed to go home, if Renty will be sent home, it will not create a precedent, since precedents have already been created. And here, even in the close circle to Agassiz, who commissioned these daguerreotypes, and here in Pennsylvania University, they decided to restitute some of the skulls that Morton collected, plundered from different people. And here you see an image of protest, return them all, not just a few of them. And here you see one of the cases of restitution of objects, and I will not have time to dwell on the gestures, but these are important. For more than 75 years, Jewish property has been also restituted in the wake of Nazi expropriation and looting. And as an Arab Jewish scholar myself, I feel a personal commitment to ensuring that redress, restitution, and repair are not solely the province of Jewish victims, and Jewish victims only post-World War II as part of what I call the Judeo-Christian invention, because Jewish property that was expropriated during centuries in England, in Germany, and in France, and in other places was never restituted. But since World War II, the restitution of property plundered from Jews became an emblem, while we know how many items were plundered from other people who are still in museums. Such approach to exceptionalize restitution for Jews further exceptionalize us at our own and other marginalized groups' expenses. Now I would like to move to the category of crimes against humanity. These crimes, and I'm quoting here Hannah Arendt, are not committed only against the victim, but against the community whose law is violated. Saying it differently, very briefly, obviously, the victims are being targeted by this kind of imperial violence, this kind of enslavement violence, but we have to relate to these crimes not as the problem or the burden of the victims. We have to relate to them as an attack on the community of which they were part. And I would like to continue with Hannah Arendt reasoning when she gave, the explanation of what are crimes against humanity. This is a category that was introduced in the Nuremberg trial without full account, and Hannah Arendt did this work in Eichmann in Jerusalem. So another major aspect that she raises of crimes against humanity is the creation of a racial order, aiming to physically or politically eliminate groups of people from the shared world. This is an organized attack on human diversity, and here I'm quoting her, upon a characteristic of the human status, without which the very words mankind or humanity would be devoid of meaning. But most white people under the regime of slavery did not perceive slavery as a crime. They did not view as crimes kidnapping, selling, purchasing, and forcing Black people to do different tasks, or subjecting them to physical and psychological violence, or treating human beings as property. And the world in which white people were allowed to determine who could be property and what constituted a crime, and where the harm of non-white was imperceptible to the system of law, that some of it endures till today, the system of law that they enacted constitutes a sustained attack against human diversity. And this sustained attack that makes these crimes imperceptible in a way that we are still invited to museums to look at those daguerreotypes as if they were slaves rather than kin is part of what I argue is a crime against humanity. That the victims' skin color made the crimes against them imperceptible to the white ruling minority in Columbia, South Carolina, is one of the signs of crimes against humanity. So the question of kinship here is primary. Lanier and Harvard are not equal parties debating ownership over a piece of property. These daguerreotypes were seized from Renty and Deliah in a world in which, and I'm quoting Hortense Spiller, flesh was for sale, flesh was summed up as a medium of exchange. Denying Harvard the property rights, and this is what the lawsuit actually demands, right? That Harvard will disown what they seized violently. So denying Harvard the property rights to what was stolen from Lanier's great-great-grandfather and his kin is a way to repair kinship for Lanier, wounded by the long afterlife of slavery. And I'm quoting Spiller again, if kinship were possible, the property relations would be undermined, which means slavery will not exist. And if not then, under the regime of slavery, so now. Renty and Deliah were forced to enter a museum collection, and Lanier demands that they be repatriated to where they belong, among their relatives. And any technical or scientific explanation of the procedure of the daguerreotype cannot ignore that these daguerreotypes would not exist without the subjects being forced to have a portion of their naked skin open to the light and reflected onto the sensitive surface of these plates. So these daguerreotypes are, in a literal sense, the remains of their presence, forced enslavement and unwilling nudity. So we have to relate to them also under the category of human remains, and there is a more consensus around the restitution of human remains, which is actually repatriation. What was seized from Renty is congealed in the photographic image itself. It is a remnant of his presence, an imprint of his flesh interacting with light that Harvard continues to claim as a museum asset. He is my ancestor, Lanier argues, not your medium of exchange. Lanier claims the restitution of the objects, but actually she expects the repatriation of her ancestors' remain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aïsha. That was an amazing, very inspiring and very moving presentation. We'll return to it later. I will now introduce our next speaker, who is Gabrielle Moser. Gabrielle Moser is an art historian, writer, and independent curator. She's the author of the book Projecting Citizenship, Photography and Belonging in the British Empire. She's also a founding member of Amelia, which is in caps, and she's an assistant professor of aesthetics and art education in the Faculty of Education at York University in Toronto, Canada. Over to you, Gabby. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nalu. Can everyone hear me? Yeah?
Yeah.
Perfect. And I'm just going to share my screen. Can everyone see the first slide?
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. I want to thank Chris and the Photo Demos team for inviting me and organizing this great event. I want to start by acknowledging my presence on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and I want to recognize the current treaty holders who are the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. In this talk, I think about two historical moments when the camera was used to capture the ongoing violence of the so-called Indian residential school system in Canada. One where the event of photography has spurred on the intervention of the civic body, and another when it failed to do so. And I look particularly to two uses of the camera in the school environment, places shaped by the settler state imaginary as sites of subject transformation. Taken almost 100 years apart, photographs of children in residential schools on the right failed to rouse civic intervention in the supposedly unseen conditions of the schools, while contemporary images of the toppling of a monument to Egerton Ryerson, whose ideas were foundational to the residential school system, have elicited strong spectatorial responses about an imagined settler future. In both cases, viewers looked but failed to see the violence these images capture. Attending to Ariella Aïsha Azoulay's description of the event of photography as a social and political encounter, separate from the photograph that may or may not result from it, I'm interested in tracing acts of disobedience and refusal on the part of photographic subjects across these images. Importantly for Azoulay, the event of photography is a space of contingency and sovereignty in which the encounter between human subjects is never entirely in the sole control of any one of them. I want to suggest that by keeping open the unfinished nature of history, the event of photography holds open the violence of settler colonialism, rather than resolving it under the guise of reconciliation. Whereas the photographed event has often succeeded in making this violence into a static, seemingly inevitable event. And it's here that I want to locate photography's reparative potential in changing how we sense history from an inevitable trajectory already concluded to one that is unfinished and still in need of repair. Building on my collaborative work with Anishinaabe curator and scholar Adrienne Heward, I imagine reparations beyond legal and financial frameworks imposed by the state, and see it instead as an ongoing event in need of our active participation as spectators. Drawing on psychoanalyst Melanie Klein's model of reparation, where the subject vacillates between positions of violent harm and loving repair, we argue elsewhere that while reconciliation presses into our minds a false understanding of our past and constricts our collective sense of the future, as Métis scholar David Garneau writes, reparation entails a future-oriented refusal to forgive. And I want to thank Adrienne for introducing me to the work of Lakeison feminist scholar Rachel Flowers, who argues that forgiveness assumes a singular event that can be reconciled and forecloses the love and rage necessary to Kleinian reparation. It was, I imagine, both love and rage that motivated a group of citizens in Toronto who on Sunday, June 6th, 2021, marched from the Ontario legislature to a downtown university where the statue of Ryerson, from whom the university takes its name, stands at the center of campus. Members of the public had already placed dozens of pairs of shoes representing some of the countless children who were neglected, abused, and killed in state care at the statue's feet. Using ropes, power saws, and sheer human force, the statue was toppled and its head was decapitated. Photographers captured the moment it was severed, its presentation at the feet of a residential school survivor, and its dunking into the waters of Lake Ontario. The felling of the statue marked the conclusion of a rally held in response to the announcement that the remains of 215 children had been identified in a mass burial site at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia on the left, followed by another 751 unmarked graves found by the Cowessess First Nation on the grounds of the closed Mary Evil School in Saskatchewan. And I want to just emphasize that in both cases, Indigenous nations dug up this set of human remains. Only a small fraction of the thousands of children we know did not come home from these genocidal institutions. Designed as an aggressive form of assimilation and modeled after the Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania, Indian residential schools in Canada forcibly removed Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis children from their families, replaced or removed their names, forced them into religious conversion, and forbade them from spiritual and linguistic practices. The school's stated aim was to kill the Indian to save the child, and the announcements of the discovery of mass graves at these sites confirmed what Indigenous peoples already knew, that they were sites of not just social, but literal death. The confirmation was a violent reminder of the unfinished history and ongoing nature of settler colonialism in so-called Canada. It should be obvious, I hope, that the toppling of the statue of Ryerson was part of a transnational repertoire of revolt, to borrow Ileana Selajan's excellent term from yesterday, demanding reparations for this history. A repertoire epitomized by the hashtag Rhodes Must Fall actions in South Africa, and more recently, Black Lives Matter's removal of a statue of the 17th century slave trader Edward Colston from its pedestal in Bristol, England, which was also dumped in the nearby harbor in June 2020. As was the case with these earlier acts of civil mobilization and refusal, the felling of the statue of Ryerson was a much photographed event, appearing on social media and in newspapers across the country in the following days. Less photographed on social media and in newspapers was the university's official removal of the pedestal, carried out behind hoarding, but captured by photographer Robert Burley from his office inside the adjacent building. Only 24 hours after the fall of the statue, the university's president confirmed it would be neither restored nor replaced. And a few weeks later, the Board of Governors publicly announced the institution would accept a sweeping set of recommendations from Indigenous community members, including a commitment to change the university's name. And I should say that these recommendations have been publicly pursued by the community since 2010, but were only accepted in the months following the fall of the statue. Where the photographed event of the toppling of the Ryerson statue led to almost immediate institutional change, the tens of thousands of photographs of residential schools themselves failed to mobilize spectators in the same way. Throughout Library and Archives Canada's photographic collections, and in collections in nearly every province and territory, the camera was used to promote, obscure, reveal, and conceal the violence directed at Indigenous children in state care. Taken by state and amateur photographers, these images span almost a century, following the life of this colonial infrastructure, and frequently employ the before and after format common to anthropological and missionary photography from the 19th century onwards, designed to demonstrate the transformation of the subject through imperial education. These photographs circulated widely. As photographer Michelle Pearson Clark writes, "We have all seen these images, but refused to imagine the unphotographed violence they dared not depict." So why did these images fail to move spectators? They are, as Mariana Hirsch and Leo Spitzer argue, formally indistinguishable from class portraits. And they often depict, as Janice Forsyth has shown, sports teams and extracurricular activities that might evoke nostalgia rather than shock on the part of white settler viewers. It's perhaps because of this familiarity that residential school portraits were and continue to be used by apologists of the system as evidence of the well-being of students and the acceptable conditions in the school. Yet, as Métis scholar Sherry Farrell-Rissette points out, there are cues that not all is right in these images. Individual faces scowl or stare defiantly at the camera. Despite a policy of cutting off the hair of incoming students, an experience of profound loss and grief for Indigenous peoples, there is the occasional viewer, or subject with long braids who has managed to keep their hair that can be spotted amongst the rows of shaved heads and uniforms. As Rissette shows, there are few, if any, individual portraits in the archives of residential schools. The schools were exhausting spaces of constant surveillance. Eradicating any right to interiority or privacy alongside all ties to the students' communities, the residential school system worked in tandem with the Colonial Museum to isolate Indigenous cultures from one another and by putting them on permanent display. Designed to contain their subjects and render them as static, the photographs of students at residential schools fail to capture events that fit within the narrow band of what the settler colonial imaginary is able to perceive as violence. But that does not mean that the violence is not there to see. When viewers encounter these images in the archive, a site that I argue is another potent place where the event of photography unfolds. How do we mobilize the sovereignty of the photographic subject in our looking as part of our civic duty to refuse this history as finished? I pose this question because I'm hopeful that photography provides a space where this can happen, though my work in the colonial archive often makes me skeptical. As I have written elsewhere, though I turn to the event of photography as a radical space for a civic and reparative imaginary, I do so as a weak and occasionally weary viewer, one who recognizes that I may not be able, or worse, willing to see those outside the framework of citizenship. For Azoulay, the viewer has inexhaustible capacities for looking, for acknowledging her complicity in the uneven distribution of rights, and for instigating political transformation of that distribution. And while I want to believe that viewers can use their encounters with photographs to contest the division of citizens from non-citizens, I am not always convinced that they will. So my question in looking at these images is a pedagogical one. How do viewers learn to see citizens where they are told to see only subjects? And what do we look away from when we look for citizens in photographs? Despite this skepticism, I want to end with one final and more hopeful example, where viewers seemed incapable of seeing the violence depicted in the photographs of the schools. The image of activists and land defenders pulling down the bronze statue of Ryerson was framed as an act of violence, of defacement or vandalism, again and again by the media and the state. Meanwhile, quietly, the university was able to remove the statue from campus as a finished event, avoiding what would have been a lengthy public debate about the future of the statue as a stand-in for a settler future. And so the reappearance of the statue's head on June 7th, the day after the rally, at 1492 Land Back Lane and captured by the camera, was therefore an important instance of the event of photography, enacting a return and articulating a refusal to forgive. The address of the photograph marks a reclamation camp set up by Six Nations of the Grand River in Caledonia, Ontario, where land defenders are contesting attempts by the state to develop the territory. In this site, the beheading of the statue separates Ryerson's image from the settler colonial body and nation state he represents. And I am imagining it as what Karen Strassler might describe as a reparative image event. But it's one that also involves the collaboration of two non-human agents, the bronzed head of the colonial agent and the land stewarded by Indigenous peoples. The photograph of the impaled statue therefore enacts what Yves Tuck and Kei Wen Yang describe as a decolonized and unsettled future. It is a warning and a reminder, a shaming figure that welcomes the settler state to sovereign territory, but forcefully marks its boundary. And as only photographs can do, it also creates an imaginary space for reparation that is not yet possible. As writer and activist Zoe Samudzi writes, reparation is articulated in a grammar of futurity that requires imagining a world that does not exist, but one that could be fabricated. And if, as Azoulay has also argued, the beginnings of photography can be traced back to 1492, with the empire's first act of shuttering off imperial violence as finished, as historical, the location of this photograph, this event of photography, is doubly meaningful. It implicates the means of its production and reproduction in the demand that the land be returned to sovereign Indigenous nations. And my hope is that in seeing these recent images of the statue and its photographic reappearance, we as spectatorial citizens are capable of better seeing the violence of residential school photographs, of violence whose liveness requires ongoing and immediate reparation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby. So let's move on to our final speaker, Chris Pinney, leader of Photodemos Collective. So let me introduce Chris. Chris Pinney researched photography in Nepal, India, and Bangladesh for Photodemos. He is Professor of Anthropology and Visual Culture at University College London. His research interests center on the art and visual culture of South Asia, with a particular focus on the history of photography and chromolithography in India. His public...
And I think that's what I communicate. On your specialty.
Someone speaking. Oh, sorry, Chris. So his publications include Camera Indica, Photos of the Gods, The Coming Photography in India, Photography and Anthropology, and Lessons from Hell, Printing and Punishment in India. He is principal investigator on the European Research Council Advanced Grant Photo Demos. Chris, take it away, please.
Hi, hello everyone. Let me just share my screen. Are you seeing what I hope you should be seeing? Right, we just want this. Does that look okay, Vindhya? Oh, Nalu?
Yes, that's great, Chris.
Okay, great.
Sorry, I was responding to a question. Yeah.
No, thank you. Much of the conceptual starting point of photo demos has been informed by Ariella Aïsha Azoulay's work, especially what we took, perhaps mistakenly, to be the politically optimistic narrative in Civil Contract. Indeed, one might see photo demos as an attempt to vernacularize or demoticize a utopian reading of photographic ontology. Ariella had argued in her early work, at least, that photography makes possible a new form of civil imagination because of its inclusiveness, contingency, and unexpected ends. At the heart of this hypothesis is a refusal to reduce representation to mere power, as in the Foucauldian approach, and to instead see it, following Walter Benjamin's insights, as an active, unpredictable, and potentially transformative process. It spoke to the subjunctive, or indeed proleptic, potential that Karen Strassler labeled photographies as if. Ariella argued that photography has created, I'm quoting, has created a space of political relations that are not mediated exclusively by the ruling power, inculcating, quote, civil skills that create, quote, civil knowledge and facilitate a, quote, citizenship of photography. These are aspects of the civil contract which Ariella notes she has encountered, quote, at any and every site where there has been photography, and that is almost everywhere. This offered new hope. Under the influence of early Foucault, a school of photographic theory had arisen which persuaded a generation of academics and their students that there was no such thing as photography. There were only multiple photographies, and these were all informed by a wider discursive context. Far from being characterized by an indexical exorbitance, photographs were best viewed as, quote, paltry pieces of paper, that's a quote from John Tagg, underdetermined scraps which required inscription by powerful discursive formations in order to be able to advance their fraudulent claims that they were capable of describing the world through direct reference. It's in this context that Tagg asks whether power should ever be afraid of photography. Tagg's answer was no. The importance of Ariella's early work, it seemed to us, was that it allowed us to imagine the conditions under which it might be possible once more again to say yes. Her questions opened up possibilities and political potentials which that earlier orthodoxy had foreclosed. Benjamin and his legacy in Ariella's work offered escape from reductive positions into the ambivalence and complexity of the photographic event. It was perhaps the Benjaminian legacy in Ariella's early work that also served as the ground for the critique of anthropological and sociological approaches to photography, in which the image was presented as a disciplinary sidekick, a tool capable of easy manipulation, or as simply empty, as in Bourdieu's study of 1960s popular French photography. Ariella's stress on the contingency of the Ariella's stress on the contingency of the event, e.g. through her reading of Mayer and Pearson's 1859 studio image of Napoleon III's son, pointed to a much richer, exorbitant field, which was often, or perhaps always, beyond the control of the photographer and their controlling ideology. This helped us see how photographs spoke as much to the future as the past. Several of the Photo Demos collective worked in high migration economies such as Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Nigeria, where the ID photograph was folded not so much into a coercive past identity, but into future aspirations, albeit ones that existed under the capricious shadow of global capitalism. The seasonal transformation of photo studios into diversity visa processing centers seemed in harmony with the aspirational images of travel and movement produced by the same studios at other times of the year. The photograph, it seemed to us, was not so much a mirror with a memory as a mirror with imagination, or a prism that allowed one to glimpse the future. And also maybe allowed access to a beyond. I became fascinated by the popular tourist destination of Jaflong in northern Bangladesh. The river Pian, which separates Bangladesh and the Indian state of Meghalaya, attracts numerous younger Bangladeshis, many of whom avail of the services of one of the dozens of photographers who use printers on floating barges to produce images for their clients. Tourists sit on rocks in the middle of the river, i.e. between the two nation states, and exchange WhatsApp details with Indian tourists who flock from the Meghalaya side. Photography is deeply entangled in this fantasy of border crossing and escape to a beyond. The portrait of a young man called Hira featured on the cover of Camera Indica in a mise en abîme, a kind of visual black hole through which the image fell backwards in time to an impossible moment of past capture. The cover showed his brother Ramlal holding a portrait of Hira, who in turn holds a portrait of their father. I had known him when I first conducted field research in the early 1980s in central India as a kindly Harli, an annually contracted labourer. Shortly after I left the village, he was killed by a train, his akal mrityu, his untimely death, giving him the status of a juja, the status most commonly attributed to a warrior decapitated in battle. The image I encountered of Hira in 2019 in the breakaway Dalit settlement near the village railway station, where his brothers now live, seemed to move in the opposite direction, falling forward into a future in which he served as a guide. Gokul, the son of another of Hira's brothers, Nagulal, was possessed with the presence of Hira at least twice a year during each of the 9 nights of the goddess, and served as a conduit for an audience eager for Hira's advice on relationships and medical and employment anxieties. The memorial photograph of Hira directly animated the possession, Hira's pret or soul passing from the surface of the photographic image into Gokul's body. These 2 iterations of Hira's photographs, the Camera Indica incarnation and his current animated presence, dramatize 2 different modes of photography, one solemnizing the past, as in the formula presented by Bourdieu in his study of 1960s French photography, and the other prophetic and future-oriented and filled with unknowability, something close to what Ariella describes as the recognition that not only were the photograph, I quote, not only were the photographed people there at the moment of exposure, but that in addition, they are still present at the time I'm watching them. If I had time, we could explore this in relation to Gai Jatra in the Kathmandu Valley in Nepal, where photographs of relatives who have died during the previous year are paraded and assisted in their onward journey. And note, this is a festival of projection rather than simple remembrance. Ariella also goes on to make a distinction between the event of photography and the photographed event as a way of understanding images that, quote, never come into being. The event of photography, photography's ubiquity and permeation into almost every aspect of human existence, establishes a photographability even where no photographs exist. Consequently, some of the most heightened discussions about photography concern photographs which do not exist, but which ought to, their hypothetical existence becoming an expectation of modernity, transparency, equity, or most fundamentally of history itself. What Paul Valéry in 1939 called the mere notion of photography creates expectation and reorients our demands of what will be. A poignant triumph of the event of photography over the event of a specific photograph can be found in Kostis Kalantzis's account of mainland Greeks' valorization of primordial originary images and film footage that could, might, ought to have been taken to document the slaughter of civilians by Nazi troops. He reports that a space in a commemorative museum had been left vacant to accommodate this yet to materialize evidence. There are echoes of this too in the response of Nadvi, a Bangladeshi ready-made garments worker activist, to the group photograph of Rana Plaza victims collected as part of Taslima Akhtar's activist photographic archival work and subsequently incorporated into a memorial quilt about which Taslima spoke yesterday. The absence of an individuated portrait of one of the victims, her face was recoverable only through an image of her together with 7 fellow workers, provoked the demand that there should have been such an individuated image. To recall Valéry, the eye became accustomed to what it should see. The conversation with Nadvi made clear that the relationship between photographic representation and political representation operates in a sphere beyond the literal existence of photographic images. Rather, a form of latent photographability emerged as a form of entitlement parallel to those within more conventional citizenship claims. In Nadvi's reasoning, the collective nature of the portrait pointed to a double injustice: destruction through the corporate murder of so many, and the denial of the kind of individual visual representation that was every worker's right. So I'm persuaded that photography is best grasped as a gerund, photographing. This allows an escape from the essentialization of a singular photography and equally problematic insistence on multiple and incommensurable photographies. Photographing remains, to recall Jennifer Badurek, unfixed, and it is, to recall Karen Strassler, necessarily eventful, always taking place and open-ended. I'm also encouraged to recall recent comments by Mark Seeley that the photograph will always remain a crime scene, and that one feature of its ontology is that, generally speaking, attempts to rewrite the photograph result in a legible defacement that point to what was once there and can never be abolished. Here I think of some remarkable images from India, where attempts to erase have merely heightened the presence of what was sought to be abolished. I see that, perhaps too nostalgically, as contingency's last laugh, proof of the tenacity of the photographic event. One is also reminded of the story of the Black Madonna of Częstochowa, the powerful Polish saint whose image was arrested in the dark days of Russian rule. Her framed images had supposedly been paraded in public by Karol Wojtyła, the future Pope John Paul II, who the next day continued his peregrinations with an empty frame, before which roadside devotees bowed with even greater fervency. This speaks to an ineradicable resonance, where everything is half seen in advance. The image does not need to be present. Where photography is ubiquitous, the individual photograph need only be conjured in the mind's eye. The photographic event is no longer required to summon it into being. I've searched for photographs of the Częstochowa empty frame, but have failed to find it. I fear that I wanted it to exist as a mark of its historicity, but that it failed to oblige. Ariella stresses the consistency in her position of her positions from civil contract to potential history's unlearning imperialism. It's perhaps the naivety of my interpretation of the photographic event that makes me see utopian possibilities for a citizenship in advance, for the performance of the not yet become in the photographic event that become much harder to grasp through the imperial shutter. But citizens of photography, photodemos, has benefited enormously from Ariella's generative thought and generosity. And we hope that through our ethnographic investigations of actually existing social practice, we have contributed to the debate in which she has been a central and invigorating presence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I think you all agree that those have been three outstanding presentations with which to round off our amazing virtual program. So now we're open for questions. Please feel free to unmute yourself, to raise the hand. It would be nice to get for people to ask the questions themselves. And you can also put them in the chat, and I'm happy to read them out. But it's also nice to have an interactive discussion. I think all three presentations are very, very stimulating and provocative, and also very moving. So I hope that you will overcome your shyness and just jump in. I'm scanning. I can't see any raised hands. So maybe I will go in first. Wow. Oh, I mean, almost in tears, actually. I really, particularly Ariella and Gabby's presentations, I really felt them in my heart and being, and I'm trying to keep a scholarly head on and just not start ranting and raving and heading for the barricades, although count on me for that. So I would like to really, this question of the hidden violence in the photograph, juxtaposed against the animated presence of the photograph. And I just, maybe speaking across your presentations, also this idea that's there very clearly of thinking about corporate murder, really. What Chris has said, that what's his name? I'm sorry, I've forgotten. Said that every photograph is a crime scene, and I really think that
was Mark Seeley.
Yeah, Mark Seeley. Sorry, Mark, if you're listening to this in hindsight. Sorry, I apologize. But yeah, and I mean that is really powerful as well. And I think in the call for Renty's repatriation, really it is about this, the presence, the real ancestral presence in the photograph, but that really resonates also in Gabby's presentation and also in what Chris has shared, particularly the story of Hirat, who then has become an ancestor that people consult for sort of divination. So I wonder if you three want to say a little bit more about this, the interrelatedness of both the hidden violence, the sort of neo global situation we're in of corporate murder, and the animation vis-a-vis a real true embodiment that has no closure point, that those children we're looking at are still calling for justice, and the violence is very present with us, as it is with in the other two presentations.
I mean, I can say something briefly maybe about the one of the things that interests me about the felling of the statue and the images of it is that it's also a moment of alliance between Black activists and Indigenous activists whose understanding of ancestry and the ongoing liveness of colonial history is quite different from the one I inherited through my education. So for me, yes, that moment of felling the statue and then having its head reappear is also an activation of the violence that that statue embodies and how that hasn't also finished or ended, as a way to try and bring better, greater attention to that live history. But I mean, I find myself also so saddened by the constant reinscription of that act as violence, whereas the tens of thousands of photographs of the schools are not treated that way or seen that way.
Maybe I'll jump next. Thank you for great presentations, Chris and Gabby. Really fantastic to be in the same session, and thank you also for helping me to think about my own work. So grateful. Now to try to engage with your question about hidden violence. So I would like to try to take it from the perspective from, across generations, let's say. These images were discovered by a worker at the Peabody, Ellen Reichlin, in the 70s. And she started to pursue, immediately, research for ancestors, but she was fired. She was fired and her research was blocked. She continued it, on her own, and she published the first essay, I think, about these daguerreotypes. And in each and every essay that was written later, there was a recognition of the violence. So it's not that the violence was hidden. So I think that we have, on the one hand, addressed the question of hidden violence as a question of how people engage with it, who sees it, who do not see it. But when I look, in retrospect on all the texts that I read about this daguerreotype, there is a recognition of the violence, even though, on the surface, it's not, an image of genocide. It's an image of, people in the studio. Everybody acknowledges, that they're enslaved, which means brutal violence. Everybody acknowledged that they were forced to to pose naked to the camera, etc. So I think that what we must bring into the conversation, and here, Chris, maybe this is, part of what I would say in connection to how I explain, my transition from the civil contract to potential history, is not that I renounce, all these, potentialities that photography have, but also to rethink on a global scale about the ontology of photography as an imperial ontology that, as with all other imperial technologies, we always see people engaging with keeping alive options. And this is also maybe, Gabi, my interest to hear you more about how do you recognize that people didn't recognize this violence while you say that they recognize it in the later activist image. because, when I think, for example, about 70 years of, violence against Palestinians, so I can say that people do not recognize the violence, right? That the violence is kept hidden, but it is not fully true. First of all, for Palestinians, they don't need the photographs, right, in order to recognize this violence, but also for Jews in Palestine, they recognize the violence, but it doesn't, this understanding or this recognition of the violence doesn't translate into an understanding of the ontological condition imperialism created, that this violence, even if you recognize it, either you relate to it as something that belonged to the past, or you relate to it as something that belonged to the victim, not to yourself. So I think that when I'm engaging with the category of hidden violence, I always start by relativizing it. And maybe even saying that it is oftentimes not hidden. But the question is, how do we understand it not only in the realm of photography, but how do we dare to connect what we see in photographs to the imperial conditions under which we share the world with others? So I don't know if it's a direct response to what you asked, but it's an attempt.
No, it's an excellent response. Excellent. So now all the yellow hands have gone up. So let me first go to Gabrielle from Brook. Gabby, do you want to unmute yourself, Gabrielle? Hello, Gabrielle.
Good.
You can unmute. Okay, maybe I'll move on to, oh, you are there, Gabrielle?
Yes, now it works. It says that, I wasn't allowed to unmute myself. Yeah, regarding Ariella's paper, I'd like to come back to Paul Barsu's question regarding materiality, because it seems with respect to Renty's image here, the notion of authenticity seems to be highly significant, and that is the contentious issue. And so one wonders, in the age of reproduction, would either side not accept a reproduction of the photo?
Ariella, you want to take that?
Yeah, maybe, but I'm not sure that I understand the question. I don't understand the question of authenticity.
Well, it seems that both sides are fighting for the original, authentic image, and then one can't help asking oneself, why would either side not accept a reproduction of the image so that both would have the image, as it were? That relates to the issue of ownership, or legitimate ownership in this case.
Yeah, but if you reject that these images should be dealt with the category of private property and with the terms that were shaped by the imperial institutionalization of photography, so the question of authenticity and reproduction is further violence in relation to an image that is an ancestor and should not have been taken in the first place. And once it was taken, it's like, like you think about, an ailing member of the family, the relatives of the member of the family take care for their relative, rather than an institution that was implicated in the violence of enslavement. So what I try to argue is that we are not speaking about two equal parties that are arguing about an authentic image. This is not a question of an authentic image. This is neither a precious image of photography, as this institution tried to say, and it's not about how to use the image in order to better narrate, with quotation mark in relation to Harvard, to better narrate the story of slavery. It's not, the story of slavery should not be narrated at the expenses of descendants and survivors, because we have also to integrate the category of survivors to descendants, right? Because they survived the same regime, because we are speaking, quoting Saidiya Hartman, about the afterlife of slavery. So I reject all these terms that were used and that are still being used in connection to those daguerreotype, and I'm trying to articulate the case in a different way in response to Tamara Lanier's brilliant initiative to sue our world and actually to expropriate white institutions from continuing to hold ancestors as original or as authentic or as precious images that they can explain better to the public how to view them.
Thank you, Aïsha. I'll take the next question from Asko Lemuskaliu.
Yes, thank you. Thank you first and foremost for great presentations during these 3 days. It seems clear to me from the different presentations that the kind of an iconography, the actual image content in quite a few cases is not necessarily a main way in order to know which kinds of images become iconic, become resonant, become particular kinds of image events. I got reminded now from the talk that Gabi Moser gave of what Susan Maisela said in her discussion, that sometimes what you actually see in a photo is not so important as the fact that someone was there, that you have kind of a connection via the photo again to different kinds of people. So I'd be interested in hearing more about the role of the particular kind of image content that you addressed in your talk. But I'd like to understand it better, how you see what are the kinds of elements which are important for particular kinds of images to become politically important. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I'm a longtime defender of boring images, that in fact, extremely boring images have lots of information and politics to work with. And school photographs are exactly that kind of seemingly boring and repetitive iconographic choices. So, I mean, I've gone through many of those residential school photographs for a bigger project about citizenship and race in Canada. And to me, the violence that they demonstrate is actually quite clear as soon as you spend time looking at them, despite the fact that they don't maybe hit you with a kind of iconic power the way that those activist images do. But I think that, I mean, I highly recommend Hirsch and Spitzer's book on school photographs, in which they do a masterful job of unpicking all of the acts of disobedience and refusal you can see amongst students within class photographs in all kinds of violent situations. And I think that going back to what Chris was speaking about, drawing on Costi's paper, that there's this sense of like what could, might, or ought to have been documented, that we so far have only found one instance of a student having a camera in a residential school. And the portraits that she took are of her friends, but the perspective even is totally different because she's 3 feet tall rather than the height of an adult. And the kinds of things she turns her camera towards are quite different. But I think my hope and many people's hopes is that there are going to be more of these kinds of images that are resuscitated at some point. But yeah, I tend to stay away from the idea that the image has to be exciting or dynamic in order to become iconic, even if the archive might indicate otherwise.
If I could just add, I mean, I think there's a complex dialectic between the strikingly iconic and the humbly, indexically authentic. And I think that, you know, there's a kind of, it's almost like a wave formation that structures, you know, the history of the reception of those, so that and my guess is that we're probably entering a period where the humbly indexically authentic, you know, the blurred, the difficult to interpret, the image that appears to conceal its truths will start to triumph over the image that is too transparent, too glossy, too apparently staged or difficult to believe in. I also think there are generational dynamics at work. I was very shaken recently teaching a class and trying to explain Yuri Lotman's argument about the relationship of black and white photography to mid-20th century heightened historicity, and realizing that none of the class could grasp it, because for them black and white in fact was completely deficient and devoid of historic claims, and it was only colorized images of the past that they were prepared to give any credence to. So I think the factors are numerous and complex.
Okay, thank you very much. I will take a question from Costis, please.
Yes, thank you all for tremendously powerful presentations. Ariella, I really followed your argument about visual reproduction as reproducing the original violence. However, I want to ask you a bit of a devil's advocate question, in the spirit of which informs much photojournalism still, and perhaps your earlier work on the contract. If the citizenry is still the stake here, how can it be enacted if the photos are withdrawn from the public domain, even that of the colonial Harvard environment? And if they are withdrawn into the realm of family possession, and this reminds me of some of the discussions we had yesterday about the familial as a site of resistance to the regime and whether that can be efficacious and what that means. Is perhaps a discussion to be had here about different forms of display rather than actually removal from the public domain? And also, I wonder what your thoughts were about contingency. Is contingency still, you feel, pertinent to these very closed documents of violence? Can they still spring leaks, to recall a phrase that Elizabeth Edwards used about past colonial archival imagery? And I also wonder whether you think that the kind of argument you presented today kind of revises the more optimistic aspects of the initial citizenship proposition.
Thank you. Shall I, Nalu, respond? Okay, thank
Yes,
you.
please. Yes, please.
So I'll start by, with the last question. No, on the contrary, I think that, Tamara Lanier's is the manifestation of the potentialities to reenact the civil contract of photography. The assumption that we need a photograph, while the event of photography consists of so many other aspects: the participation, the encounter between people, the presence of a camera or the presence of a photograph later, and the absence of the photograph that was present is part of it. So rather than, reducing photography or photographs to, an image that we are looking at and interpreting and giving, diverse interpretation, we have to acknowledge, and you mentioned Elizabeth Edwards, who, did this amazing work about the materiality of the photograph. We have to acknowledge the materiality also of the encounter. And the materiality of the encounter, we are actually speaking about, a political ontology, because we are not speaking about an image and people who are reading it, but we are speaking about the way that we get together, right, in a kind of civil spaces, or as people who share the world. And the question is to what we are committed, right? Are we committed to the presence of images, and that they will be the best preserved in museums? Or are we committed to other people with whom we share the world, in which photography shaped us through violence and sometimes also through reparative processes? And when going back to the beginning of your question, when you speak about the removal of the image, it seems like, we will wake up in the morning and there will no longer be images in the world. We're speaking about the repatriation of Lanier's ancestor, and she will decide whatever she will decide to do with the image. Maybe the image will disappear completely, because these images, once you take them out of the conditions that impacted them to be preserved in the way that they were preserved, meaning degraded on the plate, this image may disappear once you get it. And this is completely, fine, because it's not about preserving a stable image. It is about how people are being allowed to interact with each other, including with their ancestors. So I think that all the way that, you know, the notion of the expert was shaped in connection to the stable presence of the photograph is part of this imperial violence, the imperial violence of the shutter, because the shutter is not only about, you know, the moment the image was taken, but it is also the moment that the image now is a private property of Harvard, rather than being in circulation in the world. And the circulation can lead to the disappearance of the image. So the idea that the image should be present in order for the event of photography to take place is a misunderstanding of the political ontology of being together in the world. So I hope that I replied to your question. The contingency, yes, of course. They were not disappeared with the removal of repatriation of a single image, even if they will repatriate, you know, even the 70,000, you know, 90,000 objects that Sarah Savoy recommended that France will restitute. The museums still own millions of objects that can, you know, if they will be disowned by those museums, can lead to some, you know, more accelerated, let's say, processes of reparation that are linked to, let's say, in Gabi's presentation, in connection to Tak and Young, to land restitution, and in connection to Pinney's presentation, then the entire project of the photo demos, to the participation of the demos, not around the photographs that were removed from circulation, but rather photographs as continuously circulating and having the risk to disappear, as they all the time disappear. So now the debate cannot be that Tamara Lanier wants to remove the image from circulation. The fact that it was in circulation to begin with was the violence. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris, do you want to hold on and I take Karen's question?
Yes, Karen was waiting.
Yeah, Karen, please.
So my question is similar to Kostis's, I think, but I guess what I want to know is how is it that I could look at the photographs of Delia and Renty as my ancestors, as myself as an inheritor of their lives and their violence, the violence that they suffered, right, that I benefit from and am implicated in. And I guess it sort of goes to Gabrielle's question about the pedagogy, right? Of the question, how do we learn to see these images in a different way? And I'm really, you know, this theme that has come up in a number of papers about the thinking about images in relation to political violence as human remains, right? And what that does to think about them as standing for, in lieu of, or actually kind of manifesting bodies that were, to which harm was done, right? And how do we expand a claim to ancestry beyond maybe the family? And I'm thinking about NAGPRA, which is the 1990 law that requires the return of human remains and sacred objects in the United States from museums to the communities, right? So the remains don't go to families, they go to tribal authorities and communities. And so what would that look like in the context of slavery in the US?
Anybody want to jump in, or Chris, do you want to put your comment in first?
Well, mine was kind of allied to that, which was, and also really for Ariella. So I was interested in the way you privilege kinship. You said kinship is primary. So I was interested to know your thoughts on other, I don't know, is there a hierarchy of other claims? I mean, how would class or other social solidarities rank as against kinship? Is kinship uniquely primary?
So should I go? Okay, thank you. So I'll try to be very brief in response to Karen's and Chris' questions. So Karen, you're right. The pedagogical question is how to teach, people to see differently images. But part of it includes how to teach people not to see images that should not be seen, how to respond to claims coming from people who are implicated in these images, who are saying, don't look at these images. Please don't look at them, don't circulate them. And I'm referring to Kaz Rebel, brilliant manifesto about the exhausted bodies of colonized and other, cases where people claim, don't look at them. So I think that part of the pedagogy of photography is not, cannot lie only in the presence of the image to the eye. Closing the eyes, refusing to see is part of it. And just, very briefly about slavery, I think that, the case for reparation, because slavery was not brought to a closure in the US and in many other places, I don't think that we need any further image in order to justify the case for reparations, right? So we should also refuse to provide more images to justify the case for reparations, because it should not be that if we will find the ultimate image of violence, as if there is an ultimate in this hierarchy of violence, that the case for reparation will gain hearts in the US. We are speaking about how to undo, how to abolish the legal system that enabled the transformation of slavery into prison complex, etc., etc. So I think that we have to refuse sometimes to see, we have to refuse sometimes to go to the archive in order, there is no need for any photograph to justify the return of Palestinians to Palestine. So in this sense, I think that the absence is something that we have to take in consideration. And Chris, responding to your question, I think that in this case, kinship or kin is key. It is key because kinship was destroyed through slavery, right? So in the case of images of slavery, this question is key. And the fact that only today, 10 years ago, when Tamara Lanier started this campaign to free Renty, there was a possibility to question the right of museums to hold, remnants and images of slaves as private property. This was made possible only because she was able to track, direct ancestry. But it doesn't mean that ancestors cannot be understood in a broader sense. It doesn't mean that in any case, kinship should prevail over other parameters. So I think that part of unlearning imperial institutionalization of photography is understanding that there are different modalities of engage with photography and different categories, and we should withdraw from the universal assumption that once we recognize in this case that kinship is the most important, now we will implement it in other cases and we will deprive other modalities of ancestry, as you said, Karen. So I think that we all know it, but the question is how we put together everything that we know into a firm position against the institutions that continue to abuse our power as constituencies of those institutions. And we have a lot of power vis-a-vis those institutions. And as scholars of photography, we should mobilize it to claim that those institutions will first disown these, objects that were plundered, and then communities will find ways what to do with them and how to bring them into a closure. All monuments must fall, roads must fall, Ryerson must fall. Photography also must fall through the way that it was institutionalized. This includes the disappearance of the image from circulation and other modalities.
Great. Can I just quickly take, before we run out of time, a question from Mark Seeley. Mark, over to you.
I'm just unmuting myself. Hi, everyone. It's great to be in the conversation, and sorry I couldn't be in it longer during the day. It sounds like you've had a great time. I guess I just can't help thinking about how the word that keeps on coming back into my mind as I'm listening to presentations and thinking through this kind of really interesting and complex time is the word care. And I think this idea of care is not just in terms of healthcare, but how do we care for what's actually gone on in the past, and how do we care for the future? And I also worry about the scene in time is the only way that I can really put it forward. Because I worry about what time does to the scene, and I worry about things disappearing. Because even in running a very small institution here over a very small period of time, the history gets reinvented incredibly quickly. And I'm thinking, I can't help thinking about the need for evidence in this time. It might be that photography or photographies might not be required to, but I can't help thinking, I'm looking to materially gather, in a forensic way, the stuff. And I quite like it that the stuff is there and that the stuff is awkward and that the stuff makes you feel uncomfortable. And I think that's that place of uncomfortable, that place of being uncomfortable is a place of progress for me. I'm not sure whether we can, I've often said it's really important that we find places to rest things. And I think and I really subscribe to that, to put things down. But at the same time, I can't imagine them going away.
I want to see Harvard being uncomfortable.
Sorry, I missed it. What do you want to see our world being uncomfortable?
No, Harvard University, Peabody Museum being thrown into this position of, discomfort because they no longer own it.
Yeah.
And to start from there. For once, at least for once, right?
Oh, we can't hear you, Mark. Sorry.
Mark, you're muted. Mark, you're muted.
Sorry, I agree. I think I think it's incredibly uncomfortable. I think most of the cultural institutions that are alive and sensitive in any shape or form at the moment are uncomfortable. The question is, I think we have to amplify that uncomfortability. Otherwise, it will reset back to its comfort zone. That's the strength. And we've seen that. We've seen that around gender politics, class war, feminist perspectives, the circles of inclusion, and the way that these institutions can simply reset and incorporate the likes of you and me into their kind of conversations, which we do. But I guess I'm thinking about this in a kind of Gramsci way, the way you have to be, the only way that I can work in a way of survival in this place is to be both in it and against it at the same time. So it's full of these contradictions until this time becomes, it's uncomfortable for me and it's uncomfortable for them. Even the way that one resonates in the room as a kind of Black subject in the academy is an uncomfortable space because of the things we say, right? So it's always, I think some of us are, this embodiment of being an uncomfortable subject, speaking in the institution to photography, is something that's quite alive in the everyday. And I think you represent that, Ariella. And I think that's now a kind of, that's a place of new occupation, which is quite interesting, right?
May I say very briefly something?
Yes.
I think that the case of Tamara Lanier compelled us to take a side, because until the moment that Tamara Lanier claimed the restitution of this object, it was, it went without saying that Harvard owns it. Now there is a question, and the question: do we protect the institution and its right to continue to hold it, or do we respond to Tamara Lanier and her demand to repatriate her ancestor? Thank you.
And if I could just add something to that, Ariella Aïsha, is that you did say in your presentation that this is not necessarily opening the floodgates to restitution and reparations of other objects, but it does actually open precisely those floodgates of saying that the institution is paramount authority and cannot be challenged, which is good, but.
There's a similar case within sound studies that Dylan Robinson talks about in his book, Hungry Listening, which I highly, highly recommend, in which the Nisga'a Nation in the northwest coast of British Columbia has demanded that Library Congress destroy all copies of their sung music and storytelling, because in their worldview, every copy actually harms and makes sick the song that is copied and circulated. And so where library logic would usually say, we'll make as many copies as possible to make it available to the community, the Nisga'a Nation has demanded that all copies be destroyed because it is actually doing active harm to their objects and their worlds. So just as another way of challenging this assumption we have that these items should be made available to everyone and these institutions own these items, I think it's a great corollary within sound studies.
Thank you. We have a whole range of comments in the chat. I can quickly whiz through them. A lot of thanks and appreciation. There's a comment for Ariella from J. Jun Lee. I absolutely agree about the misunderstanding about the political ontology of being together in the world. And they say, a side note, Tamara has spoken at RISD about her strong desire to learn the daguerreotype to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, DC, as she firmly believes in making it available for public view. And Augustina Flores says, ask the question, how to recognize kinship as a kind of value in a capitalist society, in inverted commas, can we think about kinship capital? Somebody else also recommending Hungry Listening as an excellent book. So yeah. Anybody wants to say some final words before we round up?
Well, Nalu, I just had a few words to say, if
Yes,
I might at this point. To kind of try and wrap things up after an epic series of events. To be honest, I was initially rather apprehensive, and now we've done 3 days. I feel we should go on forever. It doesn't seem enough. I'm going to miss hearing about ingenious demotic practices in somewhere about which I know little or nothing, or be presented with a mind-bending concept that had previously never troubled me. A massive thanks to the various participants and also to you, the audience, for your engagement and questions. Personally, I'm especially grateful to Naluwembi for the original concept for the event, and to Vindhya and Shweta for making the techniques work so seamlessly. It's been great to be involved in a post-national conversation, finally. It's a shame it took a pandemic to make it happen. So we're glad that there's been such a vibrant silver lining to the cloud of loss and suffering. We could end this series of events with a marketing promotion of the kind that's now infecting what used to be the critical rationality of academia, but we'll doubtless find some more subtle ways to do that by and by. I won't attempt to do it now. What I'm left with most powerfully is a sense that the axis of photographic theorization and the object of photographic description and analysis is starting to shift to more accurately reflect the world as it is. As the project draws to a conclusion, I'd like to say what a fantastic pleasure it's been to work with and think alongside Naluwembi Binaisa, Vindhya Butpitya, Konstantinos Kalantsis, Ileana L. Selajan, and Sukfiya Young, who are already all going on to great things. We've all come from different trajectories, anthropology, development studies, art history, and different locations, though Vindhya and I were both born in Colombo. Alongside the amazing people I've met in central India and who fine-tuned my thinking over the decades, I think of Nalu, Vindhya, Kostis, Ileana and Sukfiya as my real peers, experts in life with whom I hope to continue conversing. It's actually a very rare privilege to be able to interact with such an interact in such an intense way over such a sustained period with such a group of rewarding thinkers. I think of you as our band of sisters and brothers who will go on arguing and debating in constructive and honest ways long after this project is finished. So thank you, Photodemos. Thank you all the speakers and presenters who've given so freely of your time, and you've given a lot, I'm very aware of that. And thank you to the audience for your engagement. Farewell.
Oh, wow.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, if it was possible,
thank you so much.
Well, thanks to all the speakers and the audience.
Can I just say, Chris, on behalf of the rest of the Photo Demos Collective, myself, Vindia, Kostis, Iliana, Sokfir, that first of all, we're super, super grateful that you brought us together, that you chose us, because I think it's in a very traditional and pretty staid anthropology department that UCL is. Us coming together as the Photo Demos Collective is truly groundbreaking, and your generosity as a scholar and as a mentor is, has made a huge difference to all our lives and careers and our own intellectual development. And we really, truly thank you. And of course, as we said, we're going to go forward together.
Yeah,